All right, what is up, everybody? So, um, really went down the rabbit hole tonight. Spent way more time than I wanted to doing this, but hey, why not? So, this is another kind of analysis type video, um, looking at the RNG of Duviri and EDA. Since EDA and ETA have the same rules, I didn't split those up, since it didn't really matter. And I noticed Um, there were a lot of comments on my previous video saying how Duviri feels a little better in terms of the RNG. And I would, in general, agree with that. You do have additional options, and then there's also the decrees that can compensate for some of the worse items that you can get. But for some reason, to me, EDA feels awful. So why? I like numbers. I wanted to think of why. So let's start with some of our assumptions going in. I saw like a few comments that people were saying like, "Oh, I only have like really good items in my arsenal and I get rid of everything else to like be prepared for RNG." But you actually have a higher chance um to get items you don't own. So I'm not sure about those ones. Now this is on the official Warframe wiki, hosted by DE. So I don't know if that's like a good strategy. Um, I kind of just went into this assuming that you're a vet and you kind of have most, if not everything. Obviously, these statistics are going to change a little bit. I don't know what this weighting is exactly. I did also combine things like, mag and mag prime would be combined in my statistics and whatnot. There are some funky rules with like incarnate adapters, but I didn't bother accounting for that because it's kind of niche, and people may or may not have incarnate adapters, and for the most part, people are going to put incarnate adapters on the strongest version of a weapon. So, um, now, so just in general, I also assumed that people had maxed out intrinsics, so Stalker was an option, in Duviri only. Number of weapon options was 8, and Warframe options was 5. Deep Archimedia, slightly different rules. If we go to the loadout section here, so you get 3 Warframes, 3 of each weapon type. Now EDA is a little different because you can choose to ignore some of the it's not, Duviri, it's actually required. You have to pick something from those categories. With EDA, you can ignore that. Now there is, I think it was, yeah, so the first column of each loadout parameter section will be something that the player owns. But that should not have too much of an effect on these statistics. So now let's get into the statistics themselves. Um, so I pulled in the JSON, for the 2024 usage stats for Warframe, which DE publishes. You can go download the JSON for that. Um, Now, this is, of course, we don't have stats for 2025 yet, so any frames that have been added in 2025 are not going to factor into this. Any weapons that have been added in 2025 will also not be here. But this is stuff that you've seen before, like I did also combine the prime and normal version of frames. So Volt is actually the most used frame. Cyto 9 was the least popular frame, which makes sense. Not everything is listed here just for readability. So I only, I just used the tick labels here every couple frames or every few weapons, just because if I included everything, it was impossible to see. But this is just to give an idea. Um, Now, what are these lines? So these are the two different options I was considering for thresholding what is a good or bad item. Now, there's the Z score, which is your standard or your mean plus some number of standard deviations. So for a Z score of 2, or greater than 2, it would be a usage stat that was higher than the mean plus 2 standard deviations, which is pretty darn high. So these are kind of like the creme de la creme weapons and warframes. So it's not going to choose a lot of the, it's a pretty limited selection to just what's really, really the best. Now, I am also making the assumption that on average, given that this is an extremely large sample size because Warframe has millions of players, um, on average, people would be choosing to use the best items. Of course, there is going to be variation there. Different people have different preferences. If everybody just used the actual best items, the plots wouldn't look like this. But given that they are so heavy-tailed, I do think that there's some merit to using this as, a basis for analysis. Now, of course, there's going to be tons of error in here that I'm not accounting for, but it's almost 3 in the morning. And, now what I ended up choosing to use as a threshold for determining which was like a bad frame or a bad weapon versus a good frame or a good weapon was the 75th percentile. Now that seemed to be a much more reasonable choice because it seemed to get like the peak much better than the Z-score approach, especially with the weapons. So, gives you a lot more options to work with in terms of what's good and what's bad. I am not making any kind of determination of if a frame is good or not. That's not what I'm trying to do here. I'm just saying, like, not a lot of people play Banshee and Oberon. A lot of people play Saren and Volt. That's all this is saying. This is DE's own statistics. My personal opinion does not necessarily align with these usage stats, but that is what it is. Now getting into the next section here. So, what is the probability of getting a good versus a bad loadout in Duviri and EDA, using the 75th percentile threshold? So, what I said is like an acceptable good loadout is like one good frame and one good weapon, using that 75th percentile threshold. And then there's also, I considered the options of like, oh, well, I got my entire loadout was good. Sometimes you're like, oh man, I got, a really good frame and really good weapons for every slot. And then there's also the all bad option, which is like, man, everything I got is trash, by these statistics. Of course, different people like different things. Maybe one person's bad loadout would be another person's perfect loadout, but those are edge cases that I'm assuming are all going to be mostly resolved by the law of large numbers. So, I guess there's a reason why Duviri kind of feels a little better. Now this is also assuming that you can you are going to follow the loadout suggestions in EDA and ETA. You can always circumvent those, but you're not going to get the full rewards. That's the issue. So this is assuming you want all of the rewards from that content. And at most you're really only going to be skipping like one. And the reason why I lean towards this is especially with the addition of ETA, the last reward is actually pretty good. Like getting that additional pack of Peely picks is actually pretty strong. So I don't like to miss out on that if I don't absolutely have to, if my choices are truly horrible. Um, so EDA, it's just Vosper, so it's a little more flexible, but we're kind of ignoring that for right now. But it will, that is a thing that exists. So for having like an acceptable loadout, the probability of that happening in Duviri is actually pretty high. It's like 70% almost. Actually, it's almost 69. Nice. EDA, way lower. We're looking at mid 30s here. The odds of getting a loadout where everything is good. I did also include the fact that in Duviri you get 8 weapon options. So like sometimes you're going to get 3 of each category and 2 of the other. So that like changes, so that does impact the statistics a little bit. But in general, you are way more likely to get a good loadout, like an acceptable loadout in Duviri, and almost impossible to get a truly terrible loadout in Duviri. Um, Now, this is where it gets a little more different, a little different. So here it's just like this is assuming that you have builds for all of those good items. Um, like I said, different people like different things. That might not be the case. Maybe you're one of those people that has 70% of your playtime on one particular frame and you really only use a couple weapons. So if you're like very picky, and so I skip, this is uh, it goes by fives, so that's why it's like this. But you know, if you're a really picky player, um, it's gonna be like so when I say partial match, it means you get at least one of your favorite warframes and at least one of the three weapon options was one of your favorite weapons, and it could have been from any category. Then the full match is like both you got one of your favorite frames and every single weapon category had one of your favorite weapons in it. So we can kind of like play around with this and see how things scale a little bit. So if you like, you know, a lot of different warframes, which pretty, you know, 50 is pretty much all the warframes at this point. So obviously, like we can kind of jack these all up to like really high. And if you like playing everything, then the odds are like, you know, basically 100%. Um, but let's say, you know, like I went and looked through my loadout and what I had favorited. And I like, you know, I think I had about 30 frames and like, you know, it was maybe something like this, right? Roughly. Um, so it was maybe like this, right? So the odds of me getting a favorite loadout, so me going like, ooh, man, that's really cool. In Duviri is like actually pretty high. And I didn't even have that many things favorited. So whereas in EDA, it's way lower. You know, we're under 50%. So every other week, you're gonna get a loadout that doesn't have any weapon or frame combo that you really, really like playing. Um, you know, full matches are obviously way less rare, but like, you know, most of the time you can get by with one good weapon. So this is a little less necessary, but I wanted to show that anyways. Um, Now the last thing I wanted to look at was the forma cost. So if you wanted to have a good build on all of those quote unquote good weapons and frames. Now the way that I calculated this is I looked at my arsenal. I looked at like Overframe, which is not like the best. I don't really like Overframe, but you know, it was a resource that I checked. I looked at some popular YouTubers for how many forma they tended to have on their frames and their weapons. Um, and so, you know, generated approximate total forma investment for all of the good items in that usage chart based on that 75th percentile statistic. And so the total forma that you would need just to have the good weapons modded is about 500, which is just under 6,000 plat if you're buying forma bundles. Now, of course, you can also make forma, you know, that'll bring this down. But that's like a pretty good chunk of change, you know, like for 6,000 plats, like quite a bit. I mean, that's like half an arcane hotshot. No, I'm just kidding. But you know, so now this is ignoring some of like the niche weapons. So part of this is me checking myself a little bit. I mean, I was definitely being a little hyperbolic in my last video. In Duviri, it's actually pretty likely that you are going to get a good frame and a good weapon. Now, whether you actually have those modded or not, because the default mod loadouts are pretty freaking awful, that's a whole different story. So if you're like, you know, you're a vet, you're like legendary rank something, you have pretty much, you have at least all the good stuff modded and set up with builds, there's like a decent chance, pretty nice chance that you're gonna be all right in Duviri. That chance is way lower in EDA, way lower. So I would, I really think, because like I didn't mind the RNG so much in Duviri. It only like really started to become a problem for me in EDA. So, and you know, of course, ETA. And this is also once again under the assumption you're trying to get all the rewards, and it kind of feels bad when you don't get all the rewards just because you're, you know, breaking a loadout restriction because you feel like you have to. So, so yeah, so that's kind of the statistics. So Duviri is actually not that bad. Gets a bad rep, I guess. I didn't give it enough credit. And EDA, in my opinion, does actually kind of suck. So that's kind of the information I put together. Take that as you will. I actually am kind of warming up to Duviri again a little bit. Like weirdly enough, I was just kind of roaming around the open world, and I was like, hey, you know, this ain't too bad. I think if like especially if you can stack decrees in Duviri, it actually gets pretty fun. Like even your operator can just do like insane damage. So um, EDA, I think you got to do a little work here. D. I think bumping this up to like 4 options per category would be a massive improvement. I mean, this would jump up way higher. I probably should have had a bar for that, but hey, you know, hindsight's 2020. So, all right, those are the numbers I put together. I thought that'd be an interesting follow up to the last video. So, appreciate your time. Thanks for watching. Catch you around.